Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is David, I'm 34, and I never forget a face. The Ozark National Forest taught me to. The October wind cut through the trees like a rusted blade as I pulled our 30-foot Winnebago into the dispersed camping area off Forest Road 1003, deep in the Arkansas wilderness. My wife, Sarah, pressed her face against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered into the skeletal branches that seemed to claw at the darkening sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered, but her voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. We'd driven 8 hours from Little Rock to get here, to this isolated spot Sarah had found on some obscure camping forum. She'd been obsessed with finding the perfect place for what she called our reconnection weekend, a last-ditch effort to save our marriage after 18 months of slowly unraveling. "Remote camping," she'd said, showing me pictures on her laptop. No cell service, no distractions, just us. Now, surrounded by towering oaks and hickories that blocked out most of the dying light, I wondered if we'd made a mistake. The nearest highway was 15 miles away. The last house we'd passed was 30 miles back, and the ranger station had closed for the season a week ago. "You sure about this place?" I asked, trying to keep the doubt from my voice. Sarah turned to me, her green eyes bright with something that might have been hope or desperation. "We need this, David. We need to remember who we are together." I nodded, though part of me wondered if we'd already forgotten that long ago. The miscarriage 8 months back had opened a wound between us that seemed to widen with each passing day. We'd stopped talking about it, stopped talking about anything that mattered. This trip was Sarah's idea of a cure, but I feared we were too broken to fix. The RV's generator hummed to life as I flipped the switches, flooding our temporary home with warm light. Through the windows, the forest pressed close on all sides, a wall of black trunks and reaching branches that seemed to lean inward, as if curious about these intruders in their domain. Sarah busied herself unpacking our supplies, moving with the manic energy she'd displayed ever since suggesting this trip. She'd planned everything down to the smallest detail. Meals, activities, even the playlist for our phones. Everything except an exit strategy if things went wrong. "I'll get the outdoor lights set up," I said, needing some air and distance from the claustrophobic interior. The night was colder than I'd expected, my breath visible in pale puffs as I strung LED lights around our campsite. The beam of my flashlight carved weak paths through the darkness, revealing glimpses of moss-covered logs and the occasional glint of animal eyes that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. It was while I was securing the last string of lights to a gnarled oak that I first noticed them. Handprints pressed into the bark about 8 feet up the trunk. They looked fresh, the bark still weeping sap where fingernails had dug in. But that was impossible. No one could reach that high without a ladder. "Sarah," I called, but she was inside the RV, humming something tuneless while she prepared dinner. I aimed my flashlight beam higher up the tree and froze. More handprints scattered across the bark like someone had been climbing. But the spacing was all wrong. Too far apart, fingers too long. And they continued higher than any human could possibly reach, disappearing into the canopy above. A branch cracked somewhere behind me and I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across empty forest. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, revealing nothing but more trees, more shadows. "David? You okay out there?" Sarah's voice drifted from the RV, muffled but concerned. "Yeah," I called back, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Just finishing up." I hurried back to the RV, telling myself it had been sap stains or natural bark formations. Trees did strange things as they grew. There was a logical explanation for everything. Inside, Sarah had transformed our mobile home into something cozy and warm. Candles flickered on the small dining table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of her famous chili filled the air, mixing with the scent of vanilla from the candle she'd lit. "This is nice," I said, and meant it. For the first time in months, She was smiling at me without that careful, brittle quality that had become her default expression. We ate dinner and talked about safe things. Work, her sister's upcoming wedding, the book she was reading. Neither of us mentioned the empty room at home that was supposed to be a nursery, or the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter, or the way we'd stopped touching each other except by accident. But as the night wore on, I found my attention drifting to the windows. Every few minutes I'd catch myself glancing at the glass, expecting to see something looking back. The LED lights I'd strung up created a small bubble of illumination around the RV, but beyond that circle, the darkness was absolute. "You seem tense," Sarah said during a lull in conversation. "Just tired from the drive." She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers cold despite the warmth inside the RV. "I know this is awkward, being alone together like this, but I want us to try, David. I want us to remember what we had." I squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar weight of her wedding ring against my palm. "I want that too." We went to bed early, curling up together in the RV's small but comfortable bedroom. Sarah fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing deep and even against my chest. But I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crack of settling branches. It was around midnight when I first heard the scratching. At first, I thought it was just a branch scraping against the RV's exterior, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A pause. Then again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I eased out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and crept to the bedroom window. The scratching was coming from somewhere near the front of the RV. I pressed my face to the glass, but the angle was wrong. I couldn't see what was making the noise. The scratching stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't return. Just as I was about to go back to bed, something pale moved past the window. A flash of white that was there and gone so quickly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every small sound made me tense. Every shift of the RV on its leveling jacks made my heart skip. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with reaching hands and pale faces pressed against dark windows. I woke to Sarah screaming. The RV was filled with gray dawn light, and Sarah was sitting up in bed, her hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with terror. "What? What is it?" I scrambled upright, instantly alert. She pointed with a shaking finger toward the wall beside our bed. The wall. There are, oh God, David, there are hands in the wall. I looked where she was pointing and felt my blood turn to ice water. The RV's interior wall, which had been smooth white fiberglass the night before, now showed the clear outlines of handprints pressed from the inside, as if someone, or something, had been trying to push through from within the wall itself. But that was impossible. There was nothing behind that wall except insulation and the exterior aluminum siding. "They weren't there last night," Sarah whispered. "I would have noticed them. They weren't there." I reached out to touch one of the impressions and jerked my hand back. The wall was warm, warmer than it should have been, and the handprint seemed to pulse slightly under my fingertips. "There has to be an explanation," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Maybe it's just condensation damage, or the temperature changes overnight." Sarah stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Condensation doesn't make handprints, David." She was right, of course. I could count at least 15 distinct impressions scattered across the wall, some overlapping, all different sizes, and they were too detailed. I could make out individual finger joints, the lines of palms, even what looked like fingerprints pressed into the soft fiberglass. "We should go," Sarah said suddenly. "We should pack up and leave, right now." Part of me agreed, but another part, the stubborn, rational part that had always served me well in my engineering career, rebelled against the idea of running from something that had to have a logical explanation. "Let's not panic," I said. "Maybe someone played a prank on us. People do that to campers sometimes." "How? How would someone get inside our walls to make impressions from the inside, David?" I didn't have an answer for that. We got dressed in silence, the handprints on the wall seeming to watch us with their invisible eyes. I made coffee while Sarah sat at the dinette, staring out the window with the hollow-eyed expression she'd worn in the weeks after the miscarriage. "I'm going to walk around outside," I announced. "Check for signs of tampering." Sarah grabbed my wrist as I headed for the door. "Don't go alone. It's daylight. I'll be fine." But as I stepped outside, I wondered if that was true. The forest looked different in the pale morning light, less welcoming, more watchful. The trees seemed closer than they had the night before, as if they'd crept inward while we slept. I started my inspection at the front of the RV and immediately found something that made my skin crawl. The aluminum siding near the bedroom wall was covered in scratches, long, parallel gouges that looked like fingernail marks. They were fresh, cutting through the paint to the bare metal beneath, but they were on the wrong side. The scratches I'd heard during the night should have been on the outside of the RV, but these marks were clearly made from the inside, pushing outward, as if something had been trapped within the walls, clawing desperately to get out. I circled the entire RV, finding more scratches, more impossible evidence of something moving within the very structure of our temporary home. On the driver's side, I discovered a section where the siding had been pushed outward in the unmistakable shape of a hand. The metal bent and distorted as if by incredible pressure. "David!" Sarah's voice was sharp with panic. "David, get in here!" I ran back inside to find her standing in the middle of the living area, pointing at the ceiling. New handprints had appeared overhead, dozens of them, overlapping and intertwining like a congregation of grasping fingers. And they were spreading as I watched, new impressions blooming across the surface like flowers of flesh and bone. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." I began the process of breaking camp with shaking hands, retracting the awning, disconnecting the electrical hookups, stowing the outdoor equipment. Sarah helped in frantic silence, both of us avoiding looking at the handprints that continued to multiply across every interior surface. It wasn't until I tried to start the engine that I realized we weren't going anywhere. The Winnebago's diesel engine turned over but wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, but got nothing except the grinding whine of the starter motor. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full and all the warning lights looked normal. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked from the passenger seat. "I don't know. It was running fine yesterday." I popped the hood and climbed out to investigate. What I found made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. The engine compartment was filled with handprints. They covered every surface, the engine block, the battery, the wiring harnesses. But these weren't impressions like the ones inside the RV. These were actual hands, pale white and translucent, reaching out from impossible spaces within the machinery itself. As I watched in horror, one of the hands moved, flexing ghostly fingers around a fuel line. Another reached deeper into the engine, wrapping around what looked like the distributor cap. They were sabotaging the engine, ensuring we couldn't leave. I slammed the hood shut and stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. "David." Sarah had gotten out of the RV and was walking toward me. "What did you find?" I opened my mouth to tell her, then closed it again. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make her understand that our RV had somehow become infested with ghostly hands that defied every law of physics and reason? "Electrical problem," I lied. "Give me a few minutes to work on it." But I knew it was hopeless. Whatever was happening to us, it didn't want us to leave. We were trapped in this isolated corner of the Ozark National Forest with something that seemed to exist both inside and outside the normal rules of reality. I tried the engine 3 more times before giving up. Each attempt brought more hands crawling out of impossible spaces within the machinery. I watched them work with horrible fascination, their movements coordinated and purposeful, like the limbs of some vast organism I could only partially perceive. "We'll have to hike out," I told Sarah. "It's 15 miles to the main road, but if we start now—" "Look," she interrupted, pointing toward the trees. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. The handprints that had been confined to our RV were spreading. They covered the bark of nearby trees, pressed into the moss, even marked in the soft earth around our campsite. And they were all pointing in the same direction, deeper into the forest, away from any chance of escape. "It's hurting us," Sarah whispered. "Whatever it is, it's hurting us like animals." The thought chilled me more than the October air. But she was right. Every path that led toward civilization was blocked by the spreading marks, while the trail leading deeper into the wilderness remained mysteriously clear. We spent the day trapped in our immobilized RV, watching the handprints multiply and spread. They covered the windows now, pressing against the glass from both sides simultaneously. Some were small, like a child's hands. Others were huge, with fingers that stretched impossibly long. All of them moved with subtle, hypnotic rhythm, as if breathing. Sarah tried her phone repeatedly, but there was no signal. The battery drained faster than it should have, and the screen showed strange distortions, images that looked almost like faces pressed against the inside of the glass. As evening approached, the hands became more active. They pushed against the windows with increasing force, and I could hear the fiberglass walls creaking under some immense pressure. The interior handprints grew deeper, more defined, until I could swear I felt fingers brushing against my back when I leaned against the wall. "We can't stay here tonight," Sarah said as darkness fell. "I can feel them. They're getting stronger." She was right. The sensation of being watched had intensified throughout the day, and now it felt like we were surrounded by invisible observers. The air inside the RV had grown thick and oppressive, carrying a smell like wet earth and old bones. "Where can we go?" I asked. "They're everywhere outside. The forest wants us to go deeper, so maybe that's what we have to do." I stared at her. "That's insane. Whatever's out there, it's trying to lure us away from safety." "What safety?" She gestured at the handprint-covered walls around us. "We're not safe here. We're trapped here. At least if we move, we might find answers." I wanted to argue, but the logic was undeniable. We couldn't leave, couldn't stay, and couldn't call for help. Our only option was to go where the handprints wanted us to go and hope we could find some way to break free of whatever had ensnared us. We packed a day's worth of supplies and our warmest clothes. The handprints on the RV's interior walls had grown so thick they overlapped like scales, and several sections of the ceiling had begun to bulge downward as if under enormous weight. As we prepared to leave our temporary shelter, I caught sight of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly, I saw nothing, but the impression lingered, something tall and pale, just at the edge of visibility. "Ready?" Sarah asked, shouldering her backpack. I nodded, though I felt anything but ready. We stepped out into the October night, and the cold hit us like a physical blow. Our breath misted in the air, and the beam of my flashlight seemed weaker than before, swallowed by the hungry darkness between the trees. The handprints on the ground glowed faintly in the flashlight beam, forming a clear trail that led northeast into the deepest part of the forest. We followed them because we had no choice, our footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. After an hour of walking, we came to a clearing I didn't remember seeing on any map. In the center stood a structure that made my blood freeze. A small cabin, dark and abandoned, with handprints covering every visible surface. But these weren't impressions. These were actual hands, pale and translucent, reaching out from the cabin's walls like some grotesque decoration. "Oh, God," Sarah breathed beside me. "What is this place?" I didn't answer because I didn't have one. The cabin looked old, maybe from the 1800s, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of old bone. But it was the hands that captured my attention. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all reaching outward in silent supplication or warning. As we watched, one of the hands moved, flexing its ghostly fingers. Then another. Soon, the entire cabin was writhing with pale appendages, a nightmare vision of reaching flesh and grasping fingers. "We should go back," I said, but when I turned around, the path we'd followed was gone. The handprints that had led us here had vanished, leaving only unmarked forest floor. "There's light inside," Sarah observed. She was right. A faint glow emanated from the cabin's windows, warm and inviting despite the horror surrounding it. And now that I looked closer, I could see that not all the hands were reaching outward. Some were beckoning, inviting us forward with crooked fingers. "It's a trap," I said. "Everything's a trap," Sarah replied. "But at least it's warm." She started walking toward the cabin before I could stop her. I had no choice but to follow, my hand tight on the flashlight even though it seemed to grow dimmer with each step. The cabin's door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of golden light within. The hands covering the exterior walls parted as we approached, creating a clear path to the entrance. Their movement was fluid, almost courteous, like curtains being drawn aside for honored guests. Sarah reached for the door handle and I grabbed her wrist. "Wait," I said. "We don't know what's in there." "We know what's out here," she replied, gesturing at the forest around us, "and it's not going to let us leave." She was right again. The darkness between the trees had taken on a quality that seemed almost solid, pressing against the edges of our vision with malevolent intent. Whatever lived in this place, it had been toying with us since we arrived, leading us exactly where it wanted us to go. Sarah pushed open the door and we stepped inside. The cabin's interior was impossibly warm and bright, lit by a fire crackling in a stone hearth. The walls were covered in handprints just like the outside, but these seemed almost decorative in the firelight, creating intricate patterns of overlapping palms and fingers. And sitting in a rocking chair by the fire was a woman. She looked to be in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple dress that might have been white once but had faded to the color of old ivory. She smiled when she saw us, a grandmother's welcoming smile that somehow made the handprints on the walls seem less threatening. "I've been waiting for you," she said in a voice like autumn leaves. Come in. You must be cold." Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was definitely not what we'd expected to find. "You live here?" I asked. The woman chuckled, a sound like water over stones. "Live here? Oh, child, I've been here much longer than living allows." That should have been our cue to run, but there was something hypnotic about her presence. The warmth of the fire, the gentle rocking of her chair, the way the handprints on the walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with her breathing. It all combined to create an atmosphere of strange comfort. "My name is Martha," she continued. "Martha Blackwood. This was my home. Oh, 60 years ago now, before the accident." "What accident?" Sarah asked, settling into a chair across from the woman. Martha's smile faltered slightly. "The mine collapse, dear. Took my husband and 2 sons, along with 30 other men from the hollow. I was pregnant then, with my 3rd child. The shock of losing them, well, it killed us both. I remained standing, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that we needed to get out of here immediately." But Sarah seemed entranced by the old woman's story, leaning forward with rapt attention. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said softly. "Oh, but that's just the beginning," Martha replied. "You see, grief is a powerful thing. It can tear holes in the world, create spaces where the dead linger and the living wander lost. This hollow became one of those spaces, and I became its guardian." The handprints on the walls were moving now, reaching and grasping with increasing urgency. I tried to get Sarah's attention, but she was completely focused on Martha. "Guardian of what?" Sarah asked. "Of the lost," Martha said. "Of the grieving. Of those who carry wounds that won't heal." Her gaze shifted to Sarah, and I saw something predatory flicker in those kind eyes. "You've lost a child, haven't you, dear?" Sarah gasped and pressed a hand to her stomach. "How did you—" "I can smell the grief on you like perfume. It draws me, calls to me. You came here seeking healing, seeking answers, seeking a way to fill the hole inside your heart." "Sarah, we need to go," I said, but my voice sounded distant, muffled. Martha stood from her rocking chair, and as she did, the handprints on the walls began reaching toward Sarah with desperate hunger. "I can give you what you seek, child. I can give you peace." "How?" Sarah whispered. "By staying. By joining us. By letting go of the pain that anchors you to a world that has shown you nothing but sorrow." The temperature in the cabin was rising, or maybe it was just my fear making me sweat. The handprints were moving faster now, creating a rustling sound like wind through dry leaves. And I realized with growing horror that they weren't just random impressions. They were attached to something, reaching through the walls from some vast space beyond. "Sarah," I said more urgently. "Sarah, look at me." But she was lost in Martha's words, tears streaming down her face as the old woman continued her seductive whisper of promises and peace. "The child you lost," Martha said. "She's here with me. Would you like to see her?" Sarah let out a sob and nodded. Martha gestured to the far corner of the cabin, and one of the walls began to change. The handprints there grew smaller, more delicate, arranging themselves into the outline of a tiny figure, and slowly, impossibly, a shape began to emerge from the wall itself. A baby, pale and translucent, reaching toward Sarah with miniature hands. "Rebecca," Sarah breathed, the name we'd chosen for our daughter, the name we'd never gotten to use. She stood and walked toward the apparition, her arms outstretched. The handprints on the walls followed her movement, growing more frenzied, more desperate. And I realized what was happening. They weren't just hands. They were the grasping appendages of the lost, the dead, the grief-stricken souls that Martha had collected over the decades. "Don't touch it," I shouted, finally breaking free of whatever spell had held me paralyzed. "Sarah, don't touch it." I lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's arm just as her fingers brushed against the phantom child. The moment we made contact, the cabin exploded into chaos. The handprints came alive with violent motion, reaching out of the walls to grasp at us with desperate hunger. Martha's kindly facade fell away, revealing something ancient and terrible underneath. A predator that fed on grief and loss, luring the wounded into her web with promises of reunion and peace. "You can't take her from me," Martha shrieked, her voice like breaking glass. "She belongs here now. They all belong here." The hands were everywhere, grabbing at our clothes, our hair, trying to drag us toward the walls that had become gaping mouths hungry for living flesh. I pulled Sarah toward the door, fighting through the grasping appendages, feeling ghostly fingers tear at my jacket. We burst out of the cabin into the October night, and I didn't stop running until the hellish glow of the windows disappeared behind us. Sarah stumbled beside me, sobbing and gasping, her hand pressed to her stomach where the phantom child had tried to take hold. "It felt real," she whispered. "She felt real." "It wasn't her," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure of that myself. It was something else wearing her face. We ran through the forest without any clear destination, the beam of my flashlight cutting erratic paths through the darkness. Behind us, I could hear the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but the rustle of countless hands moving through the undergrowth, following our trail with patient persistence. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, we found ourselves back at our campsite. The RV sat exactly where we'd left it, but now it was completely covered in handprints, inside and out. They pressed against every surface, overlapping and intertwining until the entire vehicle looked like it had been dipped in pale flesh. "How did we get back here?" Sarah asked. I had no answer. The forest seemed to fold in on itself in this place, making distance and direction meaningless. We could run for hours and always end up back where we started, trapped in Martha's domain like insects in a web. "The engine," I said suddenly. "I have to try the engine." I approached the RV cautiously, the handprints on its surface writhing at my presence. When I opened the hood, the engine compartment was clear. No ghostly appendages, no supernatural sabotage. Whatever force had been keeping us here seemed to have withdrawn, at least temporarily. The engine started on the first try. "Get in," I shouted to Sarah. "Get in now!" We threw ourselves into the RV and I gunned the engine, the vehicle lurching forward over the rough ground. In the headlights, I could see the handprints on the trees pointing back toward the cabin, trying to guide us deeper into the forest. But I turned the wheel hard to the right, following what I hoped was the route back to the main road. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to end up back at the cabin. The trees seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing in the headlight beams. But then I saw something that made my heart leap, a reflective trail marker indicating we were back on Forest Road 1003. I didn't slow down until we reached the highway. Even then, I kept driving until we hit the first truck stop with bright lights and other people, pulling into the parking lot with a sense of relief so profound it made me dizzy. We sat in the RV for a long time, not speaking, just breathing and listening to the normal sounds of civilization. Truck engines, air brakes, the chatter of CB radios. The handprints on our walls had faded during the drive, becoming dim impressions that might have been shadows or stains. By morning, they were gone entirely. But some things remained. Sarah's phone had dozens of photos that neither of us remembered taking. Images of the cabin, of Martha, of the phantom child reaching out from the wall. And in each picture, if you looked closely, you could see more figures in the background. Other lost souls, other grieving hearts that had been lured into Martha's web over the decades. We never talked about what happened in the Ozark National Forest. What could we say? Who would believe us? But Sarah changed after that night. The brittle quality that had defined her since the miscarriage was gone, replaced by something harder but also more genuine. She'd looked into the face of her deepest grief and walked away from it, choosing the pain of the living world over the seductive peace of the dead. Sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring at her hands, studying the lines of her palms as if reading a map to somewhere I can't follow. And occasionally, when she thinks I'm not looking, I see her press her fingertips against the wall beside our bed, leaving impressions that fade when I blink. I tell myself it's nothing, just tricks of light and shadow. But I know better now. I know that some wounds never fully heal, and some losses follow you no matter how far you run. The Ozark National Forest is still there, waiting for the next grieving soul to wander into its depths. Martha Blackwood is still there too, offering comfort to the wounded and peace to the lost. And somewhere in that timeless hollow, the hands in the walls are still reaching, still grasping, still calling out to those who carry holes in their hearts that can never be filled. We never went camping again, but sometimes, in my dreams, I can still feel those ghostly fingers brushing against my skin, and I wake up knowing that some traps are baited with exactly what you need most. The terrifying thing about Martha's Hollow isn't that it's evil, it's that it offers a very real kind of peace. And for people like us, people who've lost something that can never be replaced, that peace will always be tempting. The handprints in the walls weren't trying to drag us into hell. They were reaching out in the only way they knew how, trying to pull us into a place where grief doesn't exist because nothing can be lost that hasn't already been given away. Some nights, when the pain of living in a world without our daughter becomes too much to bear, I understand why someone might reach back. Story 2. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and I should have known something was wrong the moment we passed that couple on the Cascade Creek Trail in North Cascades National Park. The way they smiled too wide, the way their clothes hung loose like empty skins, the way Marcus waved back at them even though I never saw them wave first. We'd driven up from Seattle on a Friday afternoon in October, our 26-foot Winnebago loaded with enough supplies for a week of what Marcus called digital detox camping. I'd been skeptical about the whole thing. Marcus had this way of romanticizing solitude that usually crumbled the moment his phone lost signal. But after 18 months of marriage counseling and 2 near separations, I figured a week in the wilderness might either save us or finally give us the clarity to call it quits. The North Cascades had always been Marcus's favorite escape. He'd grown up camping here with his father before the old man died of a heart attack when Marcus was 15. It's the closest thing to real wilderness left in Washington, he'd said, scrolling through photos of granite peaks and pristine lakes on his laptop. No cell towers, no crowds, just us and the trees. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd said this while checking his email. We'd reserved a spot at Colonial Creek Campground, but when we arrived, the ranger, a weathered woman named Dale with suspicious eyes, told us there'd been a mix-up with the reservation system. Happens sometimes when the computer goes wonky, she said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what had happened. But I can set you folks up at a dispersed site about 8 miles up Cascade Creek Trail. More private anyway. Marcus had practically bounced on his heels. Perfect. That's even better than the main campground. Dale had given us directions to what she called the old logging spur, a barely maintained dirt road that branched off from the main trail access. You'll want to be careful up there, she'd added, almost as an afterthought. Saw's been acting up and we haven't had a chance to clear all the deadfall. Plus, there's been some unusual activity reported in that area lately." "What kind of activity?" I'd asked, but Dale had already turned her attention to the next campers in line. The drive up the logging road had been bone-jarring, our RV lurching and creaking over ruts and exposed roots. Marcus had white-knuckled the steering wheel, muttering about suspension damage, while I'd gripped the passenger seat and watched the forest close in around us like a living tunnel. The trees here were ancient, Douglas firs and western hemlocks that had been growing since before Columbus. And in the late afternoon light, they created a canopy so thick that the road beneath us seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. We'd found the dispersed campsite exactly where Dale had indicated, a small clearing beside Cascade Creek, surrounded by a horseshoe of towering evergreens. The sound of rushing water had been immediately soothing, and even I had to admit the setting was beautiful. Marcus had backed the RV into position with practiced ease, and we'd spent the next hour setting up camp, extending the awning, positioning our camp chairs, and running the water lines. "See?" Marcus had said as we'd sat down to a dinner of camp stove chili and beer. "This is exactly what we needed. No distractions, no schedules, just us." He'd been right, at least for that first evening. We'd talked more in those few hours than we had in weeks back home. Really talked, not just the logistics of grocery lists and bill payments that had become our primary mode of communication. We'd reminisced about our honeymoon in Banff, made tentative plans for a trip to Europe next summer, even laughed together when a particularly bold camp robber had tried to steal a piece of bread right from Marcus's hand. That night, we'd made love for the first time in 2 months. I should have known it wouldn't last. The first sign of trouble had come the next morning. I'd woken to the sound of Marcus moving around outside, and when I'd pulled back the RV's curtain, I'd seen him standing at the edge of our campsite, staring into the trees with his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "What are you looking at?" I'd called through the window. He'd startled, sloshing coffee on his shirt. "Nothing, just thought I saw something move. Probably a deer." "Yeah, probably." But when I'd joined him outside a few minutes later, he'd still been staring at the same spot, a gap between 2 massive hemlocks where the morning shadows seemed to pool like dark water. "Marcus? Sorry." He'd shaken his head as if clearing away cobwebs. "I'm being paranoid. It's just so quiet here." He'd been right about the quiet. In Seattle, we were used to a constant background hum of traffic, construction, and neighbor noise. Here, the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the creek's constant murmur and the occasional crack of a settling tree. But there was something else about the quiet that bothered me. Something I couldn't quite name. It felt expectant, as if the forest were holding its breath. We'd spent that second day hiking up the creek trail, following a narrow path that wound through stands of old-growth cedar and across moss-covered boulders. The trail was more demanding than I'd expected. Several times we'd had to scramble over fallen logs or navigate around washouts where the creek had carved new channels during spring flooding. Marcus had been in his element, pointing out different tree species and identifying bird calls with the enthusiasm of a man desperate to prove he still knew something about something. That's when we'd encountered the couple. We'd been about 3 miles up the trail, taking a water break beside a series of small cascades, when they'd appeared around a bend ahead of us. A man and woman, probably in their 50s, dressed in hiking gear that looked expensive but oddly pristine, as if it had never actually been used. The woman had shoulder-length blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she'd been wearing a bright red jacket that should have been visible from a considerable distance. The man had been taller, lean, with graying hair and a face that seemed pleasant enough, but there had been something off about them from the moment we'd spotted them. "Beautiful day for a hike," the woman had called out as they'd approached, her voice carrying an odd sing-song quality that had made me think of children's nursery rhymes. "It really is," Marcus had replied, standing up and brushing dirt off his hands. "You folks camping up here too?" "Oh, yes," the man had said, his smile stretching just a little too wide. "We've been here for quite some time. Such a peaceful place." That's when I'd noticed their clothes. Despite claiming to have been camping for quite some time, neither of them had shown any signs of wear. No dirt on their boots, no sweat stains on their shirts, no bug bites on their exposed skin. Even their backpacks had looked suspiciously clean, as if they'd been pulled straight from a store display. "Have you seen much wildlife up here?" the woman had asked, tilting her head in a way that had reminded me of a curious bird. "We've been hoping to spot some of the local inhabitants." The way she'd said inhabitants had sent a small chill down my spine, though I couldn't have said why. "Just some birds and a few chipmunks," Marcus had answered, though the ranger mentioned there might be bear activity in the area. The couple had exchanged a look at that, a quick, meaningful glance that had lasted only a fraction of a second but had somehow felt significant. "The ranger," the man had repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "Yes, we've heard about the ranger. Such helpful people, rangers. Always so concerned about safety." There had been another pause, during which the woman had stared at me with pale blue eyes that had seemed oddly empty, like holes punched in paper. "Well," Marcus had said finally, shouldering his pack, "we should probably head back. Don't want to lose the light." "Of course not," the woman had agreed, that strange smile never wavering. "The darkness here can be quite surprising." We'd said our goodbyes and continued past them up the trail. But after about 50 yards, I turned back to look over my shoulder. The couple had still been standing exactly where we'd left them, watching us. They'd raised their hands in unison when they'd seen me looking, a synchronized wave that had felt more like a salute. "That was weird," I'd whispered to Marcus. "What was weird? Those people, didn't they seem off to you?" Marcus had shrugged. "They seemed fine. Maybe a little chatty, but some people are just friendly." I'd wanted to argue, to point out the pristine clothes and the empty eyes and the way they'd moved together like marionettes controlled by the same puppeteer. But Marcus had already been walking ahead, and the moment had passed. We'd hiked for another hour before turning back, and I'd found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the couple following us. But the trail behind us had remained empty, and by the time we'd reached our campsite, I'd almost managed to convince myself that I'd been imagining things. Almost. That evening, as we'd sat around our camp stove eating dinner, Marcus had brought up the encounter again. "Those hikers we met today," he'd said suddenly, poking at his beans with a plastic fork. "Did you notice anything strange about them?" My heart had skipped. "Like what?" "I don't know. Just something felt off. The way they talked, maybe. And their gear. It all looked brand new." "I thought the same thing," I'd admitted. "Plus, did you see how clean they were? If they'd really been camping for quite some time, shouldn't they have been a little more rumpled?" Marcus had nodded slowly. "And that thing the woman said about the darkness being surprising. What did that even mean?" We'd sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the creek and the settling sounds of the forest around us. The sun had been setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt ominous instead. "Maybe they were just day hikers," Marcus had said finally. "Maybe they drove up from one of the other campgrounds." Maybe, but neither of us had sounded convinced. The third day had dawned gray and overcast, with a thin mist rising from the creek that gave everything a dreamlike quality. We'd decided to explore some of the shorter trails closer to camp, and Marcus had been excited about the possibility of spotting some of the area's wildlife. Black bears, mountain goats, maybe even a cougar if we were extremely lucky. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we'd found the bones. They'd been scattered in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the main trail, mixed in with the fallen leaves and forest debris as if they'd been there for years. At first, I'd thought they might be from a deer or elk. The North Cascades were full of large game animals, and it wasn't uncommon to find the remains of creatures that had died of natural causes or been taken by predators. But as we'd gotten closer, I'd realized these bones were different. They'd been arranged in a pattern, not randomly scattered as you'd expect from a natural death or even a predator kill, but deliberately placed in a rough circle about 10 feet in diameter. The larger bones, what looked like femurs and ribs, had formed the outer ring, while smaller bones had been arranged in increasingly tight spirals toward the center. At the very middle of the pattern had been a skull, bleached white by weather and time. A human skull. "Jesus Christ," Marcus had whispered, stopping dead in his tracks. "Sarah, we need to get out of here. Now." But I'd been transfixed by the arrangement, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The bones had clearly been there for a long time, months, maybe years, but the pattern had been too precise to be accidental. Someone had done this deliberately, had taken the time to arrange these remains in this specific configuration. "We have to report this," I'd said. "This is a crime scene." "Report it to who?" Marcus had demanded. "We're 8 miles from the nearest road and our phones don't have signal. By the time we hiked back to the ranger station, it would be dark." He'd been right, of course, but leaving felt wrong too, like we were abandoning whoever this had been to the forest and the things that lived in it. "Take pictures," I'd said finally, "with your camera. We'll document everything and report it when we get back." Marcus had pulled out his digital camera and started shooting, moving carefully around the perimeter of the bone circle. Through the viewfinder, the arrangement had looked even more disturbing. The precision of it, the deliberate nature of the placement. This hadn't been the work of animals or natural decay. Someone had done this, had taken a human being and turned their remains into some kind of ritualistic display. As Marcus had worked, I'd found myself studying the surrounding forest, looking for any other signs of disturbance. That's when I'd noticed the trees. Several of the larger pines around the clearing had marks carved into their bark, symbols that looked almost like letters but not quite, arranged in vertical lines that reminded me of tally marks. The cuts had healed over with sap, suggesting they'd been made months or even years ago, around the same time the bones had been arranged. "Marcus," I'd called softly, "look at this." He'd followed my gaze to the marked trees, and I'd watched his face pale. "What the hell is this place?" "I don't know. But I think we should leave. Now." We'd hiked back to camp in silence, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest that had seemed peaceful and welcoming just days before now felt hostile, full of hidden watchers and unseen threats. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow seemed to move independently of the trees that cast it. Back at the RV, we'd discussed our options. Marcus had wanted to pack up immediately and drive back to Seattle, but I'd pointed out that we'd already paid for the week, and running away felt like letting whoever had done this win. Besides, we had no way to know if the bone circle was recent or ancient. For all we knew, it could have been some kind of historical site, maybe connected to the Native American tribes that had lived in the area centuries ago. "That wasn't historical," Marcus had said grimly. "That was deliberate. And recent enough that the skull still had teeth. In the end, we'd compromised. We'd stay for the rest of our planned trip, but we'd stick close to camp and avoid hiking alone. If anything else strange happened, we'd pack up immediately and leave. It had seemed like a reasonable plan at the time. That night, I'd been awakened by the sound of something moving around outside the RV. At first, I'd thought it might be a bear investigating our campsite. We'd been careful to secure all our food in the RV's cabinets, but bears were notoriously clever about finding ways into human food supplies. But as I'd listened more carefully, I'd realized the sounds were wrong for a bear. Too rhythmic, too purposeful. It had sounded almost like someone walking slowly around the perimeter of our campsite, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and moss. I'd nudged Marcus awake, and together we'd peered through the RV's tinted windows into the darkness outside. The moon had been nearly full, casting everything in silver and shadow, but I hadn't been able to see anything moving. "Probably just a deer," Marcus had whispered, "or maybe a raccoon." But we'd both known it hadn't sounded like a deer or a raccoon. The footsteps had continued for another 10 minutes, circling our campsite in a slow, deliberate pattern. Then they'd stopped, and the forest had gone silent again. Even the creek had seemed to quiet, as if it too were holding its breath. We'd lain awake for the rest of the night, listening. The fourth day had brought more unsettling discoveries. While exploring a game trail that led away from the creek, we'd found more marked trees, dozens of them, all bearing the same strange symbols carved into their bark. The marks had formed a rough line through the forest, as if someone were marking a boundary or creating a path. Following the marked trees had led us to another clearing, this one smaller than the one where we'd found the bones. But instead of human remains, this clearing had contained something that had made my skin crawl. a collection of personal items arranged on a flat boulder like offerings on an altar. Camping gear, mostly. A torn piece of blue nylon that might have been from a tent, a hiking boot with the laces still tied, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses with one lens missing, a small pile of coins, and a waterlogged wallet that had been too damaged to open. "These are from other campers," I'd said, stating the obvious. Marcus had nodded grimly. "The question is, where are the campers?" We'd taken more pictures, documenting everything as carefully as we could, but as we'd worked, I'd noticed something that had made my blood run cold. The blue nylon fragment had looked familiar. Specifically, it had looked exactly like the fabric of the tent the couple had been carrying when we'd met them on the trail. "Marcus," I'd said slowly, "that piece of tent, doesn't it look like the same color as the one those hikers had?" He'd looked where I was pointing, and I'd seen his face go pale. "Sarah, we need to get out of here. Right now." But as we'd turned to leave the clearing, we'd heard them. Voices, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Faint, but distinct, calling out words I couldn't quite make out. "Help us," one of the voices had said, and I'd recognized it immediately. It had been the woman from the trail, the one with the too wide smile and the pristine hiking gear. "Please," another voice had called, this one belonging to the man. "We're lost. We need help." Marcus had grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to them," he'd hissed. "Something's wrong here. Very wrong." But the voices had continued, growing closer, and as they'd approached, I'd realized something that had made my stomach drop. There had been more than 2 voices now. 3, then 4, then 5 or more, all calling for help in slightly different tones but with the same underlying quality. That sing-song cadence that had bothered me when we'd first met the couple. "We're hurt," one of the voices had said. "Please help us. We can't find our way back." Marcus had pulled me away from the clearing, back toward the marked trees and the faint trail that led to our campsite. But as we'd moved, the voices had followed, staying always just out of sight but never quite fading away. "This way," they'd called. "We're over here. Please don't leave us." We'd run then, crashing through the underbrush and stumbling over fallen logs in our haste to get back to the RV. Behind us, the voices had multiplied, becoming a chorus of pleading cries that had seemed to come from every direction at once. By the time we'd reached our campsite, we'd been gasping and covered in scratches from branches and thorns. The voices had stopped the moment we'd broken into the clearing, as if they'd hit some kind of invisible barrier. "Pack everything," Marcus had said, his voice shaking. "We're leaving. Now." I hadn't argued. Whatever was happening in these woods, it was beyond our understanding, and certainly beyond our ability to handle. The bone circle, the marked trees, the collection of personal items, it all added up to something far more sinister than a simple camping trip. We'd thrown our gear into the RV with desperate efficiency, not bothering to organize or pack things properly. The awning had been retracted, the water lines disconnected, the camp chairs folded and stored in record time. Within 30 minutes, we'd been ready to leave. But when Marcus had turned the key in the ignition, nothing had happened. "Come on," he'd muttered, trying again. The engine had turned over but wouldn't catch, making a grinding sound that had filled me with dread. "What's wrong with it?" I'd asked, though I'd already known the answer would be bad. "I don't know. It was running fine yesterday." Marcus had popped the hood and climbed out to investigate, leaving me alone in the RV's passenger seat. Through the windshield, I'd watched him bend over the engine compartment, checking connections and fluid levels. The forest around us had been perfectly still, as if every living thing were watching and waiting to see what would happen next. That's when I'd seen them. They'd emerged from the tree line one by one, like actors taking the stage. The couple we'd met on the trail had been first, still wearing their pristine hiking gear and those unsettling smiles. But they'd been followed by others. Men and women of various ages, all dressed in outdoor clothing that looked suspiciously clean and new. There had been at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They'd arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around our campsite, just standing and watching Marcus work on the engine. None of them had spoken or moved, but their presence had been unmistakably threatening. "Marcus!" I'd called through the open window, trying to keep my voice calm. "Marcus, you need to see this." He'd looked up from the engine, following my gaze to the gathered figures. I'd watched his face go white. "Get in the RV," he'd said quietly. "Now." But before he could move, one of the figures had stepped forward. A middle-aged man with a beard and expensive-looking hiking boots. "Having car trouble?" he'd asked, his voice carrying that same sing-song quality as the others. "We're fine," Marcus had replied, slowly backing toward the RV's door. "Just checking the oil." "Oh, I don't think it's the oil," another figure had said, a young woman with long brown hair and a green fleece jacket. "I think it's something much more serious." The others had laughed at this, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "You see," the original woman had continued, stepping closer to Marcus, "we've been watching you, learning about you, and we've decided that you'd make excellent additions to our community." "What community?" Marcus had demanded, his hand now on the RV's door handle. "The one that lives here," the bearded man had said. "The one that's been here much longer than the rangers or the government or any of the people who think they own these woods." "We don't own anything," I'd called out through the window. "We're just camping. We'll leave right now if you want us to." "Oh, you'll leave," the woman had agreed. "But not in the way you're thinking." That's when they'd started moving. It hadn't been a coordinated attack exactly, more like a slow, inexorable advance. They'd closed in on the RV from all sides, their movements synchronized in a way that had suggested they'd done this before. Many times. Marcus had yanked open the door and dove inside, slamming it behind him just as the first of them had reached the steps. But instead of trying to force their way in, they'd simply surrounded the RV and begun touching it. Their hands had moved over the metal walls and windows with an almost sensual deliberateness, as if they were reading something in the surface that only they could see. And as they'd touched, they'd begun to hum, a low, harmonic sound that had seemed to vibrate through the RV's frame and into my bones. "What are they doing?" I'd whispered. "I don't know," Marcus had replied, frantically trying the ignition again. "But whatever it is, we need to get out of here before they finish." The engine had turned over once, twice, then caught with a rough cough. Marcus had thrown it into reverse and gunned the accelerator, but the RV had barely moved. Looking in the side mirrors, I'd seen why. Several of the figures had positioned themselves behind the vehicle, their hands pressed against the rear bumper. They'd been holding us in place. "Floor it," I'd said. Marcus had given the engine everything it had, and slowly, very slowly, the RV had begun to move backward. The figures had maintained their grip for a few feet, their feet sliding through the pine needles and moss as they'd been dragged along. But eventually, their hold had broken, and we'd lurched backward into the trees. Marcus had spun the wheel, executing a messy three-point turn that had left scratches and dents along both sides of the RV as we'd scraped against overhanging branches. But finally, we'd been facing the logging road that led back to civilization. The figures had regrouped in front of us, blocking our path. But Marcus hadn't slowed down. He'd aimed straight for them, and at the last possible second they'd stepped aside, melting back into the forest as if they'd never been there at all. We'd driven in silence for the first several miles, both of us too shaken to speak. The logging road had seemed endless, winding through forests that all looked the same, and more than once I'd wondered if we were somehow driving in circles, trapped in the same supernatural maze that had snared whoever had been scattered in that bone circle. But eventually, we'd reached the main trail access road, and from there it had been a straight shot back to Colonial Creek Campground. Ranger Dale had been in her station when we'd arrived, and she'd looked up from her paperwork with an expression that had suggested she'd been expecting us. "Leaving a little early?" she'd asked. "We found something up there," Marcus had said. "Something you need to know about." Dale had listened patiently as we described the bone circle, the marked trees, the collection of personal items, and finally our encounter with the group of impossibly clean hikers. She'd taken notes, asked a few clarifying questions, and generally behaved like someone who was hearing the story for the first time. But there had been something in her eyes, a kind of weary resignation, that had suggested otherwise. "We'll send someone up to investigate," she'd said finally. "In the meantime, I'd recommend you folks head home and try to put this behind you." "That's it?" I demanded. "People are missing up there, dead, and you're just going to send someone to investigate?" Dale had fixed me with a stare that had been equal parts sympathetic and warning. Ma'am, there are things in these mountains that have been here a lot longer than the National Park Service. Things that don't much care about our rules or our understanding of how the world works. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is walk away and be grateful you were allowed to. We'd left the park that afternoon, driving straight through to Seattle without stopping except for gas. Neither of us had spoken much during the drive. What was there to say? We'd witnessed something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the world, and now we had to figure out how to live with that knowledge. That was 3 months ago. Marcus and I are still together, though our relationship has changed in ways I'm still trying to understand. We don't talk about what happened in the North Cascades, but it's always there between us. A shared trauma that somehow brought us closer while simultaneously isolating us from everyone else. I've tried to research what we experienced, spending hours online looking for similar stories or historical accounts of strange activities in the North Cascades. I've found a few things: missing persons reports dating back decades, scattered references to unusual behavior among some camping groups, a few blog posts by hikers who describe encounters with overly friendly strangers in pristine gear, but nothing definitive. Nothing that would convince anyone who hadn't been there. Marcus has dealt with it differently. He's thrown himself into work, staying late at the office and avoiding any mention of camping or hiking. He's gotten rid of all our outdoor gear, selling it on Craigslist without explanation. Sometimes I catch him staring out our apartment window at the mountains that ring Seattle, and I wonder if he's thinking about going back. I hope he doesn't. I hope we both have enough sense to leave well enough alone. But late at night, when the city is quiet and I'm lying in bed listening to Marcus breathe beside me, I sometimes think I can hear them. Those voices calling from the forest, asking for help, pleading with us not to leave them alone in the darkness. And I wonder if we really escaped at all, or if we're just the latest additions to their collection, walking around in the world but somehow still trapped in those woods, waiting for the day when we'll inevitably return to join the others who smile too wide and wear clothes that never get dirty. Last week, Marcus mentioned wanting to take a weekend trip somewhere quiet and peaceful. Maybe the mountains, he'd said, almost casually. I've been thinking about the North Cascades. It's beautiful up there. I'd looked at him carefully, searching his face for any sign that he was joking or testing me. But his expression had been perfectly sincere, as if he'd genuinely forgotten everything that had happened to us. I don't think that's a good idea, I'd said. Why not? We used to love camping together. And for just a moment his smile had been a little too wide, his voice carrying just a hint of that sing-song quality that had haunted my dreams for months. I've been sleeping with the lights on ever since. Story 3. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and the first footprint I found at Olympic National Forest matched mine, only deeper. The day started like any other camping trip. Marcus fiddling with the RV's water hookup while I wrestled with the awning that never wanted to cooperate. We'd driven 6 hours from Seattle to reach the Salduke campground, nestled deep in the temperate rainforest where ancient Douglas firs towered like cathedral pillars and moss draped everything in emerald velvet. "Jesus, Sarah, can you help me with this thing?" Marcus called out, his voice strained with the particular frustration that comes from vacation equipment betraying you within the first hour. I left the awning half extended and walked over to where he crouched beside the RV's external panel. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool October air. Marcus had been different these past few months, jumpier, more prone to anger over small inconveniences. The divorce papers I'd found in his jacket pocket 2 weeks ago explained some of it, though he still didn't know I knew. "Here, let me." I took the wrench from his hands, our fingers brushing briefly. Once, that touch would have sent warmth up my arm. Now it felt like greeting a stranger. The campsite stretched around us in perfect Pacific Northwest glory. Site 47 sat at the forest's edge, where a narrow trail disappeared between moss-covered trunks into darkness that seemed absolute even in afternoon light. The camp host had mentioned the trail led to an old-growth grove about 2 miles in, perfect for the nature photography that had brought us here, or at least that's what I'd told Marcus. Really, I'd brought us here to have the conversation we'd been avoiding for months. The conversation about why he'd been staying late at work, why his phone was always face down, why he flinched when I touched him unexpectedly. The conversation about whether our marriage was already over. There. The water connection clicked into place. Marcus stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. Should have water now. Thanks. I watched him avoid my eyes, the same way he'd been avoiding them for weeks. Want to check out that trail before we lose the light? Marcus glanced at the forest entrance, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Was it fear? Maybe tomorrow. I'm beat from the drive. But I needed to move. Needed to do something other than stand in this awkward silence that had become our normal. I'll just walk a little way in, take some shots of the moss formations. Sarah. He caught my arm as I reached for my camera bag. Don't go far, okay? This place? He shook his head. Just don't go far. I studied his face, looking for traces of the man I'd married 5 years ago. What's wrong? Nothing. Everything's fine. The words came too quickly, the same tone he used when work calls interrupted our dinners. Just be careful. I shouldered my camera bag and started toward the trail, leaving Marcus to finish setting up camp. The forest swallowed me within 50 yards, reducing the sounds of the campground to distant murmurs. Here, the world became cathedral quiet except for the drip of moisture from high branches and the soft squelch of my boots on the moss-covered path. The trail wound deeper, bordered by ferns tall as children and fallen logs that nurse trees had claimed for their own. I stopped frequently to photograph the interplay of light and shadow, the way moss created living sculptures from dead wood, the delicate architecture of spider webs beaded with condensation. That's when I found the footprint. It pressed deep into a muddy section where a small stream crossed the trail. At first glance, it looked exactly like the print my own hiking boot would make. Same tread pattern, same size, but when I knelt for a closer look, my skin prickled with unease. The print was too deep, as if made by someone carrying far more weight than my 130 pounds, and the edges were wrong, sharper than they should be, pressed into the mud with a force that spoke of something heavier, more deliberate than a casual hiker's step. I placed my own boot beside it for comparison. Same size, same pattern, but mine barely dented the surface while this one sank nearly an inch deep. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind me. I spun around, camera clutched against my chest. The trail stretched back the way I'd come, empty and shadowed. But the snap had been close, maybe 20 feet off the path where the undergrowth grew thick enough to hide anything. Hello? My voice seemed small against the vast silence. Nothing answered except the whisper of wind through high branches. I looked back at the strange footprint, then up the trail ahead. The smart thing would be to return to camp, to Marcus and the safety of the RV. But something pulled me forward. Maybe stubbornness, maybe the photographer's instinct that the best shots always lay just beyond the comfort zone. The trail curved left around a massive cedar, its trunk so wide that 6 people holding hands couldn't circle it. As I rounded the tree, a flash of black caught my eye. A raven perched on a low branch directly ahead, watching me with eyes like obsidian beads. Ravens weren't unusual in the Olympic forest, but this one felt different. It sat perfectly still, not even ruffling its feathers in the slight breeze, studying me with an intensity that made my shoulders tense. "Pretty bird," I murmured, raising my camera. The raven tilted its head and spoke. "Pretty Sarah." My finger froze on the shutter button. The voice was clear, unmistakably human, unmistakably familiar. It was Marcus's voice coming from the bird's beak. Ravens could mimic human speech. I knew that intellectually. But hearing my husband's voice emerge from that black throat sent ice through my veins. "Marcus," I whispered. The raven hopped closer along the branch. Sarah left him. Sarah always leaves. The camera slipped from my nerveless fingers, but the neck strap caught it before it hit the ground. The bird continued watching me, and when it opened its beak again, the voice that emerged made my knees weak. "Mommy, why did you leave me?" It was Emma's voice, my daughter's voice, speaking words she'd never said because I'd never left her. Because she died at 3 years old, 2 years before I'd even met Marcus, in a car accident that tore my first marriage apart and left me hollow for years. No. I stumbled backward. No, that's not. She never said that. The raven hopped to a lower branch following my retreat. Why didn't you save me, Mommy? I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed back down the trail, my boots sliding on wet moss and muddy patches. Behind me, I could hear the heavy flutter of wings, the raven following but never quite catching up. Sarah comes back. Sarah always comes back. The voice was Marcus again, but wrong somehow. Too flat, missing the warmth that had once drawn me to him. I burst from the tree line into the campground, gasping and wild-eyed. Marcus looked up from the camp chair where he sat reading, concern creasing his features. Jesus, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. I glanced back at the forest edge but saw no sign of the raven. Just dark trees and deeper shadows. I'm fine. The lie came automatically. Just got spooked by something. A bear, maybe. Marcus was on his feet in an instant, scanning the tree line. A bear? What did it look like? How close did it get? It was nothing, really. I forced steadiness into my voice. Just shadows playing tricks. But that night, as we sat around the campfire Marcus had built outside the RV, the raven found us again. It perched on the picnic table just outside the circle of firelight, watching us eat our dinner of canned chili and camp bread. Marcus didn't seem to notice it, chatting about plans for tomorrow's hike as if we were a normal couple on a normal camping trip. The map shows a hot spring about 3 miles up the trail, he said, stabbing at his chili with unnecessary force. Might be nice to soak after all this hiking. I nodded absently, my attention fixed on the raven. In the dancing firelight, its eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflection. You're not listening, Marcus said. Sorry, I looked back at him, and in that instant of distraction, the raven spoke. Marcus knows about David. I jerked, as if slapped. David was ancient history. A mistake from 6 months ago when Marcus had been working late every night and I'd been lonely and stupid. A one-night lapse that meant nothing but would destroy everything if Marcus found out. What did you say? Marcus was staring at me, fork halfway to his mouth. I didn't say anything. You made some kind of noise, like you were surprised. I glanced at the raven, but it sat in perfect avian silence, just a bird doing bird things. Probably just the fire popping. Marcus followed my gaze to the picnic table. Huh, big raven. Don't usually see them this close to camp. So he could see it. That was something at least. I wasn't completely losing my mind. Yeah, pretty thing. I kept my voice carefully neutral. The raven tilted its head, fixing me with one obsidian eye. David was better in bed. I stood so quickly my camp chair toppled backward. I'm going inside. Sarah. I'm tired. Long day. I was already at the RV door, key fumbling in the lock. Marcus called after me, but I was inside with the door locked before he could follow. Through the window, I watched him stare at the fallen chair, confusion written across his features. The raven hopped closer to the fire, and I swear I saw it turn to look directly at me through the glass. Its beak opened and closed, but from inside the RV I couldn't hear what it said. I pulled the curtains shut. That night I lay awake in the RV's narrow bed, listening to Marcus move around outside. He stayed by the fire much later than usual, and twice I heard him talking. Long, one-sided conversations that made no sense from the fragments I could catch. Never told me that. Don't understand what you... Sarah would never... When he finally came inside, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, silhouetted against the dying firelight. I kept my breathing steady, pretending to sleep, and eventually heard him settle into the dinette that converted to his bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice speaking my daughter's words, speaking truths I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself they weren't true. Outside, something rustled in the trees with a sound like wings. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that turns hiking into a miserable slog but makes the forest eerily beautiful. Marcus was already up when I emerged from the bedroom, standing at the kitchenette window with a cup of coffee in his hands. "Morning," I said, but he didn't turn around. "That raven's back." I looked past him through the window. The bird sat on the picnic table in exactly the same spot. Black feathers beaded with moisture, but otherwise looking perfectly dry. As I watched, it turned its head to look directly at the window, directly at us. "Weird how it's not afraid," Marcus continued. "Most wild birds won't come this close to humans. Maybe it's used to campers feeding it. Maybe." But something in his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "Sarah, I need to ask you something." My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. "Okay?" "Last night, sitting by the fire, I could have sworn I heard—" He shook his head. "This is going to sound crazy." "What?" "I heard voices, like people talking, but there was no one else around." The coffee turned to acid in my mouth. "What kind of voices?" "I couldn't make out most of it, but I swear I heard someone say your name. And mine." He finally turned to look at me, and I saw the same fear in his eyes that I'd felt yesterday on the trail. "Sarah, what if this place is—" A sharp rap on the RV door cut him off. We both froze, staring at each other. "Probably another camper," Marcus said, but he moved toward the door with visible reluctance. Through the window, I could see a figure on our step, a woman in a rain jacket with the hood up, obscuring her face. Marcus opened the door. "Can I help you?" The woman pushed back her hood, and my world tilted. It was me. Standing on our doorstep was another Sarah, identical in every detail down to the small scar on my chin from a childhood fall. She smiled with my smile and spoke with my voice. "Hi, Marcus. Is Sarah home?" Marcus stumbled backward, his face going white. Behind the other Sarah, I could see more figures emerging from the tree line, more versions of us, all heading toward our campsite with purposeful strides. "What the hell?" Marcus spun toward me, his eyes wide with panic, but I was already moving, pushing past him toward the RV's rear emergency exit. "We have to go, now." "Sarah, what? Now?" I shoved open the emergency exit and dropped to the ground outside. Marcus followed, landing hard beside me as voices called out from the front of the RV. Our voices, speaking our names, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. "The truck!" I gasped. Marcus's pickup was parked behind the RV, keys hopefully still in his pocket. We ran for it as more figures emerged from the forest. I caught glimpses of them in my peripheral vision. Multiple versions of Marcus and myself, all moving with the same eerie purposefulness. One of the Marcus things was missing an eye. One of the Sarah things walked with her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Marcus fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice. Behind us, the voices grew closer. "Sarah, where are you going?" "Marcus, don't leave us here. We just want to talk." The truck engine turned over on the third try. Marcus threw it in reverse and gunned it, tires spinning on the wet gravel. In the rearview mirror, I watched our doppelgangers stop at the edge of the campsite, watching us flee with expressions of mild disappointment. All except one. One of the Sarah things smiled and waved, and sitting on her shoulder was the Raven. We made it maybe 2 miles down the access road before the engine died. Marcus tried the ignition again and again, but got nothing except the click of a dead battery, which was impossible. The truck was barely 2 years old and he'd just had it serviced. "Fuck!" He slammed his palm against the steering wheel. "Fucking piece of shit!" Outside, the forest pressed close on both sides of the narrow road. No cell service this deep in the wilderness, no other campers likely to drive by until evening at the earliest. We were stranded. "What were those things?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to tell him I didn't know, but the lie wouldn't come, because I did know, or at least I suspected. Ever since Emma died, I'd been drawn to places like this, wild places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, places where grief and guilt could take on shapes of their own. "I think they're us," I said finally, "or what we could become." "That's insane." "Is it? Look at us, Marcus. Really look." I turned in the passenger seat to face him fully. "We've been dead inside for months, going through the motions, pretending everything's fine while we tear each other apart piece by piece." His face cycled through anger, denial, and finally resignation. "You know about the divorce papers?" "Yes." "How long?" "2 weeks." We sat in silence, broken only by the tick of the cooling engine and the steady patter of rain on the roof. Outside, something moved between the trees. A flash of dark clothing that might have been a person or might have been shadow. "There's something else," I said. "Something I need to tell you." Marcus closed his eyes. "David, how did you—" "The voices last night. They told me things. Things about you, about us." He opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Was it just once?" "Yes. It meant nothing, Marcus. I was lonely and stupid and—" "When?" "6 months ago. That night you worked until 3 a.m. on the Patterson account." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I wasn't working. I was with Jennifer from accounting." The words hit me like a physical blow. "How long?" 3 months. It's over now. Is that why you wanted the divorce?" "Part of it." He stared out at the rain-soaked forest. "But mainly because we've been killing each other slowly for years. Ever since you told me about Emma. Emma, my daughter, who died before I met him, whose memory I'd shared in a moment of drunken vulnerability early in our relationship. Marcus had tried to understand, had tried to help me heal, but how could he? How could anyone who hadn't lost a child understand the weight of that grief?" "She would have been 10 this year," I said softly. "I know. I still dream about her sometimes. She's always 3, always asking why I couldn't save her." "Sarah." A tap on the passenger window cut him off. I turned to see another me standing outside the truck, rain streaming down her face. But this Sarah looked different, younger, wearing clothes I hadn't owned in years. She pressed her palm against the glass and mouthed words I couldn't hear. "Don't look at it," Marcus said urgently. "Don't make eye contact." But I was already looking, and as our eyes met through the rain-streaked glass, I heard her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. "You could have saved her, you know, if you'd been paying attention instead of texting your sister about baby names for her pregnancy. If you'd seen the other car running the red light 2 seconds sooner." I jerked back from the window, but the other Sarah was already gone. The forest looked empty except for the endless rain. "What did it say?" Marcus asked. I couldn't answer, because it had said exactly what I'd been telling myself for 7 years. Exactly what my therapist had spent months trying to convince me wasn't true, but hearing it spoken aloud, in my own voice, made it feel real again. "We have to keep moving," I managed finally. "We can't stay here." Marcus nodded and reached for his door handle, then stopped. "Sarah, before I need you to know something about Jennifer." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." He turned to face me fully. "It wasn't about you. It wasn't because you weren't enough or because of Emma or any of that. I felt invisible, like I'd disappeared into your grief and there wasn't room for me anymore." The honesty in his voice broke something inside me. "I'm sorry. So am I." We got out of the truck and started walking back toward the main road, though neither of us spoke our shared fear that there might not be a main road anymore. The Olympic forest had swallowed bigger things than 2 broken people and a failing marriage. The raven found us within a 1/4 mile. It swooped down from the canopy to perch on a fallen log directly in our path, cocking its head as we approached. When it spoke, the voice was Emma's again. "Mommy, are you coming home soon?" I stopped walking. "No." "Daddy's making pancakes, the kind with blueberries." Emma's father and I had divorced 6 months after her death, our marriage another casualty of grief and blame. He'd moved to Portland and remarried, built a new life that didn't include constant reminders of what we'd lost. "She's not real," Marcus said quietly. "Whatever it is, it's not Emma." But the raven hopped closer, and Emma's voice continued with perfect 3-year-old pronunciation. "I've been waiting for you, Mommy. It's dark here." "Stop." I took a step forward, hands clenched into fists. "Stop using her voice." The raven tilted its head the other way. "Why did you let me die?" "I didn't let you." I caught myself, recognizing the trap. These weren't questions Emma would ask. This was my guilt-given voice, my self-hatred wearing my daughter's face. "You did," the raven continued relentlessly. You were texting Aunt Lisa about baby names instead of watching the road. You saw the red light and thought you had time. That's enough." Marcus stepped between me and the bird. "Leave her alone." The raven laughed with Emma's voice, a sound no 3-year-old should make. "Uncle Marcus wants to save Mommy. But Uncle Marcus has secrets too. I'm not her uncle," Marcus said tightly. "Tell Mommy about the pills." Marcus went rigid. "What?" "Tell her about the sleeping pills you've been saving. 47 of them in the Advil bottle under the bathroom sink." I stared at my husband's profile, seeing the truth written in the tension of his jaw. "Marcus?" "It's not." He shook his head. "I haven't decided anything. They're just there in case." "In case of what?" "In case the pain gets too much to carry." The raven spread its wings, revealing a wingspan far too large for its body. "Everyone has secrets. Everyone has pain. That's what makes the forest hungry." Around us, the trees began to move, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. Moving with purpose, bending inward like a fingers closing around prey. The path behind us stretched farther than it should, while the way ahead seemed to telescope into impossible distance. "Run," I whispered. We ran. The forest came alive around us as we crashed through undergrowth that hadn't been there moments before. Branches reached out like grasping hands. Roots rose up to catch our feet, and always behind us came the sound of wings and voices. Our voices, calling our names. "This way," Marcus gasped, pulling me toward what looked like a break in the trees. But the break led only to more forest, deeper and darker than what we'd left behind. Ancient trees whose trunks disappeared into misty darkness above, whose roots formed cathedral arches beneath our feet. This wasn't the Olympic forest anymore. This was somewhere else entirely. "Look," Marcus pointed ahead. A cabin stood in a small clearing, windows glowing with warm yellow light. Smoke rose from its chimney, and through the windows I could see movement. Human figures that looked safe and normal and real. "It could be a trap," I said, but even as I spoke I was walking toward it. After hours of running through impossible forest, the promise of shelter was too strong to resist. The cabin door opened before we reached it, revealing a woman I almost recognized. She looked like me but older, wearing clothes from decades past, her hair done in victory rolls that belonged to the 1940s. "Come in," she said with my voice pitched low and warm. "You must be exhausted." The interior was exactly what a forest cabin should be. Rustic furniture, braided rugs, a fire crackling in a stone fireplace. A man sat in one of the chairs, reading a newspaper by lamplight. He looked up as we entered, and I saw Marcus's face but older, lined with years of experience we hadn't lived yet. "Sarah, Marcus," the old Marcus said, folding his newspaper. "We've been expecting you." "Who are you?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "We're who you could become," the old Sarah said, closing the door behind us. "If you make it through tonight." "Make it through what?" The old Marcus gestured toward the windows. Outside, shapes moved in the darkness. Dozens of figures that looked like us but wrong in ways that made my eyes water to focus on them. "The forest is hungry," he said. "It feeds on guilt and pain and secrets. But it can only take what you give it willingly." "We never gave it anything willingly," Marcus protested. "Didn't you?" The old Sarah smiled sadly. "You've been feeding it for months. Every unkind word, every hidden truth, every moment you chose silence over honesty. The forest has been growing stronger on your marriage's slow death. Through the windows I could see more of them gathering. Distorted versions of ourselves with too many teeth or backwards hands or faces that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. "What do they want?" I whispered. "To replace you," the old Marcus said. "To step into your lives and finish the job you started. They'll go back to your world and complete your divorce, live out your separate miseries, feed the forest forever with their borrowed pain." "But you survived," Marcus said. "You're here." "We chose differently," the old Sarah said. "At the moment when it mattered most, we chose truth over comfort, honesty over protection. We gave the forest what it really needed, which was our pain, all of it, freely given instead of hoarded like poison." Outside, the shapes pressed closer to the windows. I could see faces now. My face with black eyes, Marcus's face with a too-wide smile. The raven perched on the windowsill, pecking at the glass with a beak that had grown sharp as razors. "How?" I asked. "Tell each other the truth," the old Marcus said. "All of it. Every secret, every hurt, every fear you've been carrying alone. The forest can't feed on pain that's been shared and forgiven, and if we don't..." The old Sarah looked toward the window where our distorted reflections watched with hungry eyes. "Then they take your place, and you become them. Forever." I looked at Marcus, my husband of 5 years who had become a stranger, and realized we had nothing left to lose. "Emma died because I was texting," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I saw the other car, but I thought I had time to finish typing congratulations to my sister about her pregnancy. I chose to send a text message instead of saving my daughter's life. Marcus stared at me, and I saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "That's why you can't handle it when I'm on my phone during dinner." "Yes, Sarah." He reached for my hand. "You were stopped at a red light. The other driver was drunk. Even if you'd seen him sooner, I could have honked the horn. I could have swerved. I could have done something. Maybe. Or maybe you'd have died too." His fingers squeezed mine. "I should have understood sooner why you pulled away whenever I touched my phone. I thought you were just being controlling." Outside, the raven's pecking grew more frantic, but the glass held. "Your turn," I said. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I started planning to kill myself 6 months ago. The pills weren't the first idea. I researched hanging, carbon monoxide, even considered driving into a tree on my way home from work one night. The confession hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, I felt invisible, like I was watching our marriage die and there was nothing I could do to save it. Like I was living in the shadow of a little girl I'd never meet, competing with a ghost for my wife's attention." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was ashamed. Because admitting I was suicidal felt like admitting I was weak. And because..." He looked at the floor. "Because part of me wanted you to hurt the way I was hurting." Through the windows, the shapes grew more agitated, pressing against the glass hard enough to make it bow inward. "Jennifer was never about sex," Marcus continued. "It was about feeling needed, about having someone look at me like I mattered, even if it was a lie. I made you feel like you didn't matter? You made me feel like I was temporary, like you were just waiting for Emma to come back so you could resume your real life." Witty. The old Sarah and old Marcus watched us with expressions of sad recognition. The fire in the hearth burned lower, shadows growing longer around the room. "What else?" the old Sarah asked gently. I thought of David, of the night I'd let him buy me drinks and listen to me complain about my marriage, of how I'd gone back to his apartment not for the sex but for 3 hours of being someone other than the woman who'd failed to save her child. "I had an affair because I wanted to punish you," I said. "I wanted you to find out and hurt the way I hurt every day. I wanted our marriage to end, so I'd have permission to stop pretending I was okay." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "How long have you known?" "Since the morning after. You came home with guilt written all over your face. I just didn't know if you wanted me to know." The raven had stopped pecking. Outside, the shapes stood perfectly still, watching us with predatory patience. "There's more," I whispered. The old Marcus nodded. "There always is. Sometimes I'm grateful Emma died young." The words felt like acid in my throat, because she'll never know what a failure her mother turned out to be. She'll never see me destroy everything I touch, never be disappointed by how broken I am. Marcus's hand tightened on mine. "You're not broken." "I am. I have been since the day she died. Maybe before that. My first husband used to say I loved tragedy more than I loved people, that I was addicted to pain because it felt more real than happiness. Were you?" I considered lying, then looked at the hungry faces pressed against the windows. "Yes, I think I was. I think I still am." "Then we can work on that," Marcus said. "Together if you want. Even after everything, especially after everything." The shapes outside began to waver, their forms becoming less solid. The raven tilted its head, and when it spoke, The voice was its own, harsh and wild and real. Clever, it croaked, but not clever enough. The glass finally shattered. They poured through the windows like smoke given form. All our twisted reflections, all our buried shames made manifest. The Sarah with the tilted head reached for me with fingers too long, while the one-eyed Marcus lunged at my husband with a grin full of broken teeth. But as they touched us, something unexpected happened. They began to dissolve, not disappearing, becoming part of us. The tilted head Sarah merged with my shadow. The broken-tooth Marcus flowed into the lines around my husband's eyes. One by one, they joined us instead of replacing us, adding their pain to ours, but somehow making the total weight less than the sum of its parts. Forgiveness, the old Sarah said as the last of the shapes faded into us. That's what the forest really feeds on. Not guilt or pain, but the moment when you stop fighting them and make them part of who you are. The cabin around us grew transparent, showing the real forest beyond. Ordinary trees under ordinary stars, the Olympic wilderness exactly as it should be. The old Sarah and old Marcus became transparent too, smiling at us with faces that held all our future sorrows and joys. "Will we see you again?" I asked. "Every day," the old Marcus said. "In every choice you make to be honest instead of kind, to be real instead of perfect." They faded with the cabin, leaving us standing in a moonlit clearing I recognized, the grove at the end of the trail from our campsite. We were less than a mile from the RV. Marcus's truck keys appeared in his hand, though he didn't remember dropping them. We walked back in comfortable silence, fingers interlaced, carrying our shared weight together for the first time in years. The forest felt peaceful now, just trees and moss and the small sounds of nocturnal life going about its business. The RV sat exactly where we'd left it, awning still half extended, camp chairs still arranged around the cold fire pit. Marcus's truck started on the first try. "Should we pack up tonight?" he asked. I considered the question, looking at the forest that had tried to consume us and had instead made us whole. "Tomorrow morning. I'd like to see how this place looks in daylight. Together. Together." We slept in the same bed that night for the first time in months, not making love but simply holding each other while the forest sang lullabies outside our windows. In the morning, I woke to find a single black feather on my pillow. The raven's gift or warning, I couldn't say. We broke camp slowly, reluctant to leave the place that had nearly destroyed us but had ultimately given us back to each other. As we drove away, I saw the raven one last time, perched on the trail marker at the forest edge. It didn't speak, just watched us go with eyes that held all the wisdom of wild things. Marcus and I didn't divorce. We went to counseling instead, learning to carry our pain together instead of alone. He flushed the pills down the toilet the day we got home. I deleted David's number and joined a grief support group for parents who'd lost children. We still fight sometimes, still hurt each other in small ways that accumulate over time. But now we have tools for cleaning wounds before they fester, words for naming pain before it grows teeth. Emma would be 11 now. Sometimes I still dream about her, but the dreams have changed. She doesn't ask why I couldn't save her anymore. Instead, she asks if I'm happy, if I'm taking care of myself, if I remember that love doesn't end just because life does. I always tell her yes, but sometimes, in quiet moments when the shadows grow long and memory feels more real than the present, I catch myself listening for the sound of wings. The forest may have taught us to carry our pain together, but it's still out there, still hungry, still waiting for the next broken heart to wander down its trails. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear the raven calling from places where no ravens should be. From the grocery store parking lot at dusk, from the space between radio stations during long drives, from the silence that follows when Marcus asks if I'm okay and I pause just a beat too long before answering. The forest marked us that night, claimed us in ways we're still discovering. We survived by feeding it our truth, but truth is a renewable resource. Pain regenerates. Secrets grow back like weeds if you're not careful. Last month, Marcus came home late from work without explanation. The old me would have retreated into suspicious silence, let resentment build until it poisoned everything. Instead, I asked directly, "Are you having another affair?" "No," he said, hanging up his coat. "I'm seeing a therapist, alone. There are some things about my childhood I need to work through before I can bring them into our marriage." The honesty hit me like cool water on a burn. "Anything I should know about?" "Not yet. Maybe someday." He kissed my forehead. "But I'll tell you when I'm ready, instead of letting it eat at me until I do something stupid." We're learning, slowly, to be real with each other instead of perfect. It's harder than it sounds. Perfection is a comfortable lie. Reality has sharp edges that draw blood. But every small truth we share feels like a small victory over that hungry darkness in the woods. Every honest fight we have instead of polite silence is another meal we don't feed to the forest. Emma's birthday was last week. For the first time in 11 years, I didn't spend the day drowning in what-if scenarios. Instead, Marcus and I drove to the cemetery and told her about our trip to Olympic National Forest, about how we almost lost each other but found ourselves instead. I placed a black feather on her grave, the one I'd found on my pillow that morning after. As I stood up, I could have sworn I heard her voice carried on the wind. No longer 3 years old, but the 11-year-old she would have been. "I'm proud of you, Mommy." The voice was real or imagined, I couldn't say. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time, I believed it might be true. We drove home as the sun set behind us, talking about dinner plans and weekend errands and all the small mundane details that make up a life. Ordinary conversation between two people who had learned to be ordinary together, flawed and honest and real. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something black taking flight from the cemetery trees. But when I looked again, there was nothing there except empty sky and the promise of night falling. The forest had given us back to each other, but its price was eternal vigilance. Not against some external evil, but against the small daily choices that can rot a relationship from within. The choice to lie instead of hurt someone's feelings. The choice to suffer in silence instead of asking for help. The choice to assume the worst instead of giving the benefit of the doubt. Every marriage is a forest, really. Dark paths and hidden clearings, places where you can lose yourself if you're not careful. Beasts that wear familiar faces, feeding on the pain you refuse to share. Marcus reached over and took my hand as we drove, his fingers warm against mine. In that simple touch was all the truth we'd learned to carry together. That love is not the absence of pain, but the willingness to hold it without letting it consume you. That sometimes the only way out is through. That the monsters we feed in secret grow stronger than the ones we face together in the light. The raven may still be out there, perched in the branches of someone else's story, speaking in borrowed voices to broken hearts who haven't learned yet that sharing wounds is the only way to heal them. I hope they find their way through the forest. I hope they find each other on the other side. But that's their journey to make. We're home now, Marcus and I, building a life from the pieces of who we used to be. It's not perfect, it's not always easy, but it's real, and it's ours, and the forest can't touch what we choose to give freely to each other. The raven's voice still echoes sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, in the quiet moments when memory feels more solid than the present. But now, when it speaks, I listen without fear. Because I know now that the voice was never Emma's, never Marcus's, never David's. It was always mine. All the cruel words, all the buried guilt, all the accusations I'd been whispering to myself for years. The forest had simply given them wings and sent them back to me in a form I couldn't ignore. The raven was the sound of my own pain calling me home to itself, demanding to be acknowledged, to be integrated, to be forgiven. And in the end, that's exactly what we did. We went home. Story 4. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and I never forget a face. Devil's Backbone State Natural Area in Texas taught me to. The limestone ridge stretched ahead of us like a sleeping giant's spine, all white rock and cedar breaks under the October sun. I'd driven our rented Class C motorhome up the winding FM road with Marcus riding shotgun, his camera already clicking away at the hill country vistas. Behind us, our friends Jake and Emma were bickering about campsite selection while their golden retriever Bailey panted between them. There, Marcus pointed to a clearing just off the primitive camping area. Perfect spot for the RV and close enough to the Backbone Trail for sunrise shots. We'd planned this trip for months. 4 college friends reuniting after Emma's messy divorce, all of us pretending we weren't here to keep her from falling apart completely. The isolation felt therapeutic, miles from cell towers and the digital noise that usually consumed our lives. Devil's Backbone was known for its challenging hikes and panoramic views, not for the stories locals whispered about people who wandered off the marked trails. I should have paid attention to those stories. The first evening passed normally enough. We set up camp chairs around a fire ring, roasted hot dogs, and shared a bottle of wine while Bailey chased fireflies. Emma seemed lighter than she'd been in months, laughing at Jake's terrible jokes and helping Marcus organize his photography gear for the morning. The night sounds of the hill country settled around us. Owls calling, something small rustling through the cedar, the distant howl of coyotes. "God, listen to that," Emma said, tilting her head toward the darkness. "When's the last time we heard real quiet?" But it wasn't quiet. Not really. Even as we sat there, I felt watched. The sensation started as a prickle between my shoulder blades, like standing too close to a window at night. I kept turning to look over my shoulder, expecting to see eyes reflecting our firelight, but finding only the wall of cedar and live oak that pressed close to our clearing. "Sarah? You okay?" Marcus reached over and touched my arm. "Just jumpy, I guess. Too much coffee today." Jake poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. "My dad used to camp out here when he was a kid. Said the Tonkawa Indians considered this place sacred. Something about the spine of the earth being closest to the spirit world." "Great," Emma said, pulling her jacket tighter. "Ghost stories on night 1. "Not ghosts," Jake said, his voice dropping. "Something else. The old-timers called it the Shadow Walker. Said it could take any form, but it always forgot one thing." "What thing?" I asked, despite myself. "The shadow. It could look like anybody, sound like anybody, but the shadow never matched." Marcus laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "You're full of shit, Jake." "Am I? My dad saw it once, 1974, camping with his buddies near the old quarry. One of them, Tommy Briggs, went to take a leak and came back 5 minutes later, except his shadow was pointing the wrong direction, like the sun was behind him when it was actually to his left. Dad said Tommy didn't talk the rest of the night, just sat staring at the fire with this weird smile." "What happened to him?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "Never spoke again. Not one word. They found him 3 days later in the state hospital parking lot, catatonic. He's still there, far as I know." Bailey suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked forward. A low whine escaped her throat as she stared into the darkness beyond our fire. The hair along her spine stood up like she'd been electrified. "What is it, girl?" Emma called softly. The dog growled once, sharp and warning, then bolted toward the RV. We heard her claws scrambling up the metal steps and the thump of her body hitting the door. "Probably just a raccoon," Marcus said, but he was already reaching for the flashlight. I stood up, my skin crawling with that watched feeling again. "I'm going to check on her." The RV door was locked, which was strange since we'd left it open for Bailey to come and go. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking more than they should have. Inside, Bailey had wedged herself under the dinette table, trembling. "Hey, what's wrong?" I knelt down and reached for her, but she shrank back, whimpering. That's when I noticed the smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. It seemed to be coming from the bedroom at the back of the RV. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the counter and made my way down the narrow aisle. The bedroom door was closed, another thing that shouldn't have been. We'd left it open to let air circulate. My hand hesitated on the handle. The smell was stronger here, almost nauseating in its intensity. I pressed my ear to the door and heard something that made my blood freeze. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, like someone trying to stay very quiet. "Marcus," I called, backing away from the door. "Marcus, get in here." The breathing stopped. Footsteps pounded up the RV steps, and Marcus appeared with Jake right behind him. "What's wrong?" "There's someone in the bedroom." Jake pushed past me and yanked open the door. The flashlight beam swept over the small space, rumpled bed, our suitcases, nothing else. The smell had vanished as completely as if it had never been there. "Sarah, there's nobody here." I pushed in beside him, my own light joining his. The room was exactly as we'd left it, down to Marcus's camera bag on the foot of the bed. But something was wrong. It took me a moment to realize what. "The window," I whispered. The bedroom window was open about 6 inches. None of us had opened it. "Maybe the latches are loose," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Old RV, things settle." We spent the next hour checking every inch of the motorhome and the area around our camp. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been within a mile of us. Bailey finally emerged from under the table but stayed close to Emma, occasionally whining and looking toward the tree line. "I think we should pack up," I said as we gathered around the dying fire. "Come on, Sarah," Jake said. It was probably just a mechanical thing with the window. Maybe thermal expansion or something. Then explain the breathing. Old RV, weird acoustics. Could have been the wind, but I knew what I'd heard, and it wasn't wind. We stayed. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the October air carrying the scent of cedar and limestone dust. In daylight, our fears seemed foolish. Emma insisted on hiking the Devil's Backbone Trail, claiming she needed the endorphins. Marcus wanted to photograph the sunrise from the ridge, and Jake was already planning our route to the old quarry. Bailey seemed back to normal, though she stayed closer to us than usual. We set out around 7, following the white limestone trail as it wound up the spine of the ridge. The views were spectacular. Rolling hills covered in live oak and cedar stretching to the horizon. The morning mist rising from hidden valleys. "This is incredible," Emma said, spreading her arms wide. "I feel like I could breathe for the first time in months." Marcus was in his element, camera clicking constantly as he captured the play of light and shadow on the limestone. Jake had brought a GPS unit and was marking waypoints, determined to find the old quarry his father had mentioned. We hiked for 3 hours, stopping frequently for water and photos. The trail was well marked and easy to follow, but as we climbed higher, I noticed something odd. Other hikers' footprints in the dust, heading both directions along the trail. Normal enough, except some of the prints looked wrong. The spacing was off, as if someone had been trying too hard to match a normal stride, and the depth varied strangely. Some steps pressed deep into the limestone dust, while others barely left an impression. "Look at this," I called to the others kneeling beside a particularly clear set of prints. Marcus jogged back to where I was crouched. "What about them? Look at the spacing. And see how this one is really deep, but the next one is barely there? Like someone was trying to walk normally, but kept forgetting how." "You're overthinking it," Jake said. "Different people, different weights, different gaits." But as we continued up the trail, I kept noticing more of those strange, inconsistent prints. And they all seemed to be heading in the same direction we were, toward the highest point of the ridge. We reached the summit around noon. The view was breathtaking. 360 degrees of Texas Hill country rolling away beneath us. Marcus went into photographer mode, setting up shots and checking light angles. Emma found a flat rock and lay back, arms behind her head, soaking up the sun. Jake consulted his GPS and pointed northwest. Quarry should be about 2 miles that way, off the main trail. "Let's eat first," Emma said. "I'm starving." We found shade under a lone live oak and broke out our trail food. Sandwiches, trail mix, water that tasted like heaven after the climb. Bailey sprawled in the shade, tongue lolling. It was Emma who noticed it first. "Hey, check out the weird rock formation over there." About 50 yards away, near the northern edge of the ridge, a cluster of limestone boulders had been arranged in what looked almost like a circle. From our distance, it appeared natural, but something about the spacing seemed too deliberate. "That's not natural," Marcus said, lowering his sandwich. "Look at the gaps between the stones." They're too regular. We walked over to investigate. Up close, it was obvious the boulders had been moved by human hands. They formed a rough circle about 20 feet across with a clear opening facing north. Inside the circle, the limestone was worn smooth, as if by countless feet or bodies. "This is old," Jake said, running his hand over one of the stones. "Really old. Look at these markings." Carved into several of the boulders were symbols I didn't recognize. Not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something in between. They looked like they'd been made with metal tools, deep gouges in the limestone that had weathered smooth over decades or centuries. "I'm getting pictures of this," Marcus said, pulling out his camera. "Maybe we shouldn't," I said. The watched feeling was back, stronger than ever. "This feels like something we should leave alone. It's just some old Indian ritual site," Jake said, but his voice sounded uncertain. "Historical significance." Emma had walked to the center of the circle and was turning slowly, arms outstretched. "You can feel it, can't there? Like energy or something?" "Emma, get out of there," she laughed. "Sarah, you're being paranoid. It's just rocks." But as she spoke, her shadow seemed to flicker, just for a moment, like a candle flame in a breeze. I blinked and it was normal again. "Did you see that?" I grabbed Marcus's arm. "See what?" "Emma's shadow. It moved wrong." Marcus looked at me with concern. "Sarah, you've been jumpy since last night. Maybe the altitude is getting to you." I wanted to argue, but Emma was already walking back toward us, grinning and claiming the circle had given her a contact high. We gathered our gear and headed back down the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of that circle. The hike down was uneventful until we were about a mile from camp. Bailey suddenly stopped, hackles raised, and stared into a thick grove of cedar off to our right. Her growl was low and continuous, a sound I'd never heard her make before. "What's wrong with her?" Emma asked. "Probably smells something," Jake said. "Deer, maybe, or a javelina." But I followed Bailey's gaze into the cedar grove and saw movement. A flash of color that looked like fabric, there and gone in the space of a heartbeat. "Someone's in there," I said. "Where?" Marcus raised his camera, zooming in with the telephoto lens. "I don't see anything." "There," I pointed. "Behind that big cedar." This time, we all saw it. A figure in a red shirt, standing motionless about 30 yards into the grove. The person appeared to be facing away from us toward the deeper woods. "Hey," Jake called out. "You okay over there?" The figure didn't respond. "Maybe they're hurt," Emma said. "We should check." But Bailey was backing away from the grove, whimpering. Every instinct I had was screaming danger. "No," I said. "Something's wrong. Look at the shadows." The afternoon sun was hitting the grove from the west, casting long shadows eastward. But the figure's shadow was pointing north, as if lit by a completely different light source. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered. As we watched, the figure slowly turned toward us. Even at 30 yards, I could see it was wearing Emma's face. Emma gasped. "What the hell?" The thing that looked like Emma raised one hand in a slow wave, smiling with Emma's mouth but not Emma's eyes. Behind it, deeper in the grove, I caught glimpses of other figures. One in Jake's blue hiking shirt, another in Marcus's distinctive orange cap. "Run," I whispered. The thing wearing Emma's face tilted its head and the smile widened into something inhuman. "Run!" We ran, down the trail at a pace that should have killed us, stumbling over rocks and roots, Bailey bounding ahead with her tail tucked. Behind us, I could hear crashing through the underbrush, but I didn't dare look back. Emma was crying as she ran, great sobbing gasps that echoed off the limestone walls. We didn't stop until we reached the RV. Jake fumbled with the keys while Marcus and I watched the trail behind us. Nothing emerged from the woods, but I could feel them watching from the shadows. "What were those things?" Emma demanded once we were inside with the door locked. "I don't know," I said, but Jake's story from the night before kept echoing in my mind. Shadow Walker. Takes any form, but forgets the shadow. "We're leaving," Marcus declared. "Right now." But when Jake turned the key in the RV's ignition, nothing happened. He tried again. Click. Nothing. "Battery's dead," he said, his voice tight with panic. "That's impossible. We just drove up here yesterday." Jake popped the hood, and we all climbed out to look. The battery terminals were corroded beyond belief, covered in white and green crystals as if the battery had been leaking for months instead of hours. "This doesn't happen overnight," Marcus said. I was already looking toward the tree line, expecting to see those familiar faces staring back at us. The sun was getting low, painting the limestone ridges orange and red. Soon, it would be dark. "The ranger station," Emma said. "It's only 5 miles back down the road. We can walk it." "Not in the dark," I said. "Not with those things out there." We spent the next hour fortifying the RV, locked every window, drew all the curtains, made sure the door was secured. Jake found jumper cables in the storage compartment and tried to boost the battery with our portable jump starter, but even that seemed to have mysteriously drained overnight. "It's like something sucked the power right out of everything electronic," he muttered. As darkness fell, the sounds began. Scratching at the windows. Soft at first, like tree branches in the wind, but too rhythmic to be natural. Then came the voices. "Sarah," Emma's voice calling from outside, but Emma was sitting right next to me, gripping my hand so tight her nails drew blood. "Sarah, why won't you answer me?" The voice was perfectly Emma's. Same inflection, same slight rasp from years of smoking. "I'm hurt, Sarah. I need help." "Don't listen," I whispered. Now Marcus's voice joined in. "The door's stuck, guys. Can you let me in?" Marcus was pressed against the opposite window, his face pale in the battery-powered lantern light. "Hey, what's the big idea locking me out?" Jake's voice this time, annoyed and familiar. "Come on, this isn't funny." The real Jake was huddled near the driver's seat, shaking his head frantically. "Sarah, Emma, Marcus, Jake." The voices cycled through our names, sometimes alone, sometimes in harmony. Perfect mimicry down to the last vocal inflection. They'd all our conversations, our jokes, our fears. Bailey had wedged herself under the dinette table again, silent except for the occasional whimper. Smart dog. She knew what was out there. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Something was testing the windows, probing for weaknesses. I heard the distinct sound of fingernails on glass, long deliberate scrapes that made my teeth ache. "Why won't you let us in?" Now it was my own voice, calling from outside. "Sarah, why are you being so mean?" Hearing my own voice plead from the darkness was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. It was perfect. Not just the sound, but the cadence, the slight upturn at the end of questions that had been my speech pattern since childhood. "This isn't real," Emma whispered. "This can't be real." But the scratching continued, and the voices grew more desperate, more hurt. They knew exactly what to say to twist the knife. "Emma, please," my voice again. "I'm sorry about what I said about David. I didn't mean it. Please let me in." Emma flinched. We'd had that exact conversation 3 months ago during her divorce, and I had said hurtful things about her ex-husband. Sarah would never repeat that, Emma said, but her voice wavered. Around midnight, the voices stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. We sat in the dark, afraid to make a sound, listening to our own ragged breathing and the occasional creak of the RV settling. That's when we heard the humming. A lullaby, soft and sweet, in a voice none of us recognized. A child's voice, innocent and pure, coming from directly overhead. Something was on the roof. The humming moved slowly from the front of the RV toward the back, accompanied by the soft patter of bare feet. A child walking on our roof in the middle of the Texas wilderness. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered. The humming stopped directly over the bedroom. Then came 3 soft knocks on the roof, deliberate and patient. Knock, knock, knock. "Let me in," the child's voice said. "I'm scared." "There's no kid out here," Marcus whispered. "The nearest house is 20 miles away." Knock, knock, knock. "Please. The bad things are after me." I felt my resolve wavering. It sounded so genuine, so terrified. What if there really was a child out there? "Don't even think about it," Emma hissed, reading my expression. "Remember the shadows." The child began to cry. Heartbreaking sobs that echoed through the metal roof. It was the sound of pure innocence and terror, designed to trigger every protective instinct we had. "I want my mommy," the voice wailed. I started to stand, but Jake grabbed my arm. "No. Whatever that is, it's not a child." The crying continued for another hour, growing more and more desperate. Sometimes it would move around the roof. Sometimes it would seem to come from multiple directions at once. Always the same voice, always the same plea for help. When dawn finally broke, the crying stopped. We waited another hour before anyone dared to look outside. "I don't see anything," Marcus reported from the driver's seat. Jake unlocked the door, and we stepped out into the morning light. The RV looked normal except for the scratches on the windows. Long, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made with claws rather than fingernails. "Look at the roof," Emma said. We walked around to where we could see the top of the RV. In the thin layer of dust that had settled overnight, small footprints tracked back and forth across the aluminum. Child-sized prints, but wrong somehow. The spacing was off, and there were 6 toes on each foot. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now." Marcus popped the hood again. The battery terminals were clean as new pennies, no sign of the corrosion that had crippled us the night before. He turned the key and the engine started immediately. "How is that possible?" Jake demanded. "I don't care," I said, already throwing our gear into the storage compartments. "We're leaving." But Emma wasn't moving. She was staring back toward the ridge, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Do you see that?" she asked. On the highest point of Devil's Backbone, figures moved among the limestone boulders. 4 figures in familiar clothes waving goodbye with slow, deliberate gestures. "That's us," Marcus whispered. Even at that distance, there was no mistaking our own forms. My red jacket, Marcus's orange cap, Jake's blue shirt, Emma's distinctive yellow windbreaker. They stood perfectly still except for those waving hands, and even from a mile away, I could see their shadows pointing in impossible directions. "Drive," I said. "Drive now." We pulled out of Devil's Backbone State Natural Area at exactly 8:23 a.m. on October 15th. I remember the time because I was watching the dashboard clock, counting the minutes until we reached the main highway. The drive back to Austin should have taken 2 hours. We made it in 90 minutes, none of us speaking, Bailey panting anxiously in the back. Every shadow looked wrong. Every reflection in the windows seemed to move independently. It wasn't until we reached the city limits that anyone broke the silence. "What do we tell people?" Emma asked. "Nothing," Jake said immediately. "Who would believe us?" We agreed to keep quiet, to pretend the trip had been cut short by RV trouble. But I knew we'd all been changed by what we'd seen on that ridge. Something had touched us, studied us, learned us. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't let us go so much as followed us home. The first sign came a week later. I was at work, teaching my freshman composition class, when I noticed one of my students staring at me with unusual intensity. Nothing strange about that. Students zone out all the time. But when I looked more carefully, I realized the student was mimicking my gestures with perfect precision. A half-second delay that made it look like I was seeing my own reflection in water. I stopped mid-sentence, and the student stopped too, tilting her head with the exact angle I habitually used when confused. "Are you feeling all right, Professor Chen?" she asked in my own voice. The other students didn't seem to notice anything wrong. They kept taking notes while I stood frozen at the whiteboard, staring at a 19-year-old girl who was wearing my mannerisms like an ill-fitting costume. "Class dismissed," I managed. The girl, I checked my roster later. Her name was listed as Sarah Chen, which was impossible since that was my name, gathered her things and walked out with my exact gait. At the door, she turned back and smiled with my mouth. I called in sick for the rest of the week. Marcus was the next to contact me. He'd been reviewing photos from our trip and found something that made his hands shake so badly he could barely hold the phone. "There are extra people in the background of every shot," he said. "I'm looking at the photos now, and we're all there, but there are also others, standing behind trees, barely visible, but they have our faces." I drove to his apartment and saw the photos myself. In every single image from Devil's Backbone, if you looked carefully at the shadows and background vegetation, you could make out additional figures, always in the same clothes we'd been wearing. always positioned just at the edge of visibility. "Look at this one," Marcus said, pointing to a photo he'd taken of Emma at the stone circle. "There are 3 Emmas in this shot." He was right. Emma posed in the center, but behind her, partially obscured by a cedar tree, another figure in Emma's yellow windbreaker stood motionless. And further back, almost invisible in the deep shadows, a third Emma figure crouched among the limestone boulders. "The timestamps are all wrong too," Marcus continued. "According to the metadata, I took some of these photos before we even arrived at the park." Jake's experience was different but equally disturbing. He'd started sleepwalking, something he'd never done before. His roommate found him standing in their backyard at 3 a.m., perfectly still, facing southeast, toward Devil's Backbone. When asked what he was doing, Jake would answer in his own voice but with phrasing that didn't sound like him. "Waiting for instructions," he'd said one night. "Waiting to come home." Emma had it worst of all. She began seeing herself everywhere, in store windows, in crowds, in the reflection of her bathroom mirror. But these other Emmas never matched her movements. They would wave when she waved, but always a beat too late. They would smile when she smiled, but the expression would linger after Emma's face had returned to normal. "I think they're practicing," she told me during one of our weekly check-ins. "Learning how to be us." She was right. Whatever had studied us on that ridge was getting better at impersonation. The timing was improving, the mannerisms becoming more natural, and I was starting to lose track of which thoughts were mine and which ones felt like they'd been planted by something else. The final incident happened 3 months after our trip. I was grading papers late one evening when I heard a knock at my apartment door. Through the peephole, I saw Emma standing in the hallway, but something was wrong with her posture. Too straight, like a soldier at attention. "Sarah?" Emma's voice called. "I need to talk to you about the trip." I didn't answer, suddenly certain that Emma was across town at her therapist's appointment. We'd discussed her schedule that afternoon. "Sarah, I know you're in there. We need to finish what we started." The voice was perfect, but the phrasing was wrong. Emma would never say, "finish what we started" about anything, let alone our disastrous camping trip. I backed away from the door and called Emma's cell phone. She answered on the second ring. "Sarah, what's wrong? You sound scared." "Where are you right now?" "Dr. Rodriguez's office. My appointment just ended." "Why?" The knocking at my door had stopped, but I could see a shadow under the crack perfectly still. Emma's shadow. Except Emma was 10 miles away in a therapist's office. "Emma, I need you to describe exactly what you're wearing." "What? Sarah, what's going on?" "Just tell me." Jeans, black sweater, my brown boots, the ones with the buckles." "Sarah, you're scaring me." I looked through the peephole again. The figure in the hallway was wearing jeans, a black sweater, and brown boots with buckles. The outfit was perfect. Everything was perfect except for the shadow, which pointed toward my door instead of away from the hallway light. "Drive to the police station," I whispered into the phone. "Right now. Don't go home. Don't stop anywhere. Just go to the police station and wait for me there." "Sarah." I hung up and called Marcus and Jake, telling them to meet us at the station. Whatever had followed us back from Devil's Backbone was getting bolder, more confident. It was time to stop pretending this would go away on its own. The thing in the hallway knocked 3 more times, the same patient rhythm we'd heard on the RV roof, then went silent. I waited 4 hours before opening my door. The hallway was empty, but on the floor where the figure had been standing, I found a single boot print pressed into the carpet. A perfect impression of Emma's brown boot, but the sole pattern was wrong. Instead of the manufacturer's tread, the print showed symbols like the ones we'd seen carved into the stone circle. We met at the police station and compared stories. Each of us had been visited by perfect duplicates of the others, always with some small detail wrong. Wrong shadows, wrong timing, wrong phrasing. The impersonations were improving, but they still couldn't quite get everything right. "It's learning us," Emma said, "studying how we move, how we talk, how we think." "But why?" Jake asked. "What does it want?" I thought about the stone circle, about the worn limestone inside that ring of boulders. about how many feet might have walked there over the centuries and what might have been studying those footsteps. "It wants to be us," I said, "to replace us. We tried going to the authorities, but how do you explain shadow creatures and perfect mimicry without sounding insane?" The police took our statement politely and filed it under unusual occurrence. A park ranger from Devil's Backbone returned my call and assured me that they'd had no other reports of strange activity. But when I pressed him for details about the history of the area, his voice grew uncomfortable. "Well, there have been some odd incidents over the years," he admitted. "People reporting that their hiking companions acted strangely after visiting certain areas of the park. Usually, family members claimed their loved ones came back different somehow. Different how? Hard to say. Subtle things. Speech patterns, mannerisms, personality quirks. Course, stress and isolation can do funny things to people's minds." I asked about the stone circle. The ranger was quiet for a long moment. "You found the old site," he said finally. "We don't advertise its location. Indigenous peoples considered it sacred, but also dangerous. They had stories about things that could walk in anyone's skin." "What kind of things?" "Ma'am, I'm sure there's a rational explanation for whatever you experienced. But if I were you, I'd stay away from that part of the park. Too late for that advice. It's been 6 months now since our trip to Devil's Backbone. We've all moved away from Austin, scattered across the country like we're running from something that can't be outrun. Marcus is in Portland, Jake in Boston, Emma in Seattle. I'm in Albuquerque, teaching at a small college where nobody knows my history. But distance doesn't matter. The thing that studied us, learned us, became us. It's still out there, still practicing. I see my doppelganger regularly now. In coffee shops, on street corners, in the back rows of my classrooms. Always just slightly wrong. Always watching with eyes that know too much. Last week, my own face smiled at me from a crowd of strangers, and the smile lingered 3 seconds too long. Marcus sends me photos sometimes. His doubles are getting better at holding cameras, their composition improving with each shot. Jake reports that his sleepwalking episodes have become more frequent, and he sometimes wakes to find notes written in his own handwriting, containing instructions in a language he doesn't recognize. Emma stopped calling last month. Her last message was a voicemail that sounded exactly like her but used words she would never say. "The harvest is almost complete. Soon, we won't need the originals anymore." I've tried to trace the call, but the number doesn't exist. I know it's only a matter of time before they perfect their imitation, before the shadows align correctly and the timing becomes flawless, and no one will be able to tell the difference between us and them. I've started leaving myself notes, hidden reminders of things only the real me would know, but I'm terrified of the day I find one of those notes and can't remember writing it. Sometimes I wonder if I'm even me anymore, if the Sarah Chen writing these words is the original or just a very good copy that thinks it's real. The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at my reflection in dark windows, watching for signs that my shadow points the wrong direction. The worst part is the doubt. Not knowing if the thoughts in my head are my own, or if something else is thinking them for me. Not knowing if the memories I have of that trip to Devil's Backbone are real, or if they've been planted by something that wants me to remember its origin story. But I keep writing this account, keep documenting what happened, because I need someone to know the truth. Or what I think is the truth. Or what something wearing my face wants you to think is the truth. If you're reading this and you know me, or someone who claims to be me, ask about the shadow. Look carefully at the way it falls, because that's the one thing they can't quite get right. Not yet, anyway. I have to go now. There's someone at my door, knocking in a rhythm I recognize. 3 deliberate knocks, patient and persistent. When I look through the peephole, I see my own face staring back, smiling with my mouth, but not my eyes. "Sarah," my own voice calls. "I know you're in there. We need to finish what we started." The shadow under the door points toward me instead of away from the hallway light. But here's the thing that terrifies me most. I want to open the door. Some part of me, some growing part, wants to let it in and see what happens when original meets copy. When the student is ready to replace the teacher. My hand is on the doorknob now, and I can't remember deciding to put it there. Maybe it's already too late. Maybe it was always too late, from the moment we stepped into that stone circle on the devil's backbone, and something ancient and patient began to learn the shape of our souls. The knocking has stopped. My reflection in the window is smiling. I think I'm going to open the door.